The ecosystem of Skaneateles Lake is facing a crisis. This according to local experts worried about an invasive plant now growing in the water there. It's Eurasian water milfoil. It can grow up to 25 feet in length in large patches. It not only takes away from the beauty of the lake, it also has the ability to throw off the entire ecosystem of the body of water.
Back in 2001, Rich Abbott, who was a student I had in limnology actually, but he was working for the city of Syracuse and still does in the water department, he and I had heard that there was some milfoil in the lake. We wanted to see how much it was, if it was a problem. And so he had a boat, and we got in it, and a little GPS system, and we went around the lake and identified 39 patches of milfoil that in the lake in 2001. We followed this up 5 years later, and the number of patches in the lake had almost tripled in size and number. And we were quite stunned by that. That's a very rapid rate of increase by an invasive species. And if you get that kind of increase, you got to do something fairly quickly because it's in that exponential phase of growth.
I do remember our first trip out on the lake. Most of it was that we identified was down on the south end of the lake. It was kind of quite an eye-opener back then to realize that it was spreading pretty rapidly on the south end of the lake.
And we quickly concluded that the milfoil was really the problem child. This thing can grow very, very rapidly, spreads out all over the place. And when it dies off, it rots and decomposes and makes a big problem. So we knew that this was going to be the one we had to deal with. I went to the town board, and I also went to the village board and explained what was going on there. They both were very concerned about it, and the town established an aquatic invasive committee. The first thing we knew we had to do was to raise some money. But there was another group in the area that was the Skaneateles Lake Association. So we got together with them and asked if they'd be willing to help us fundraise and would they accept funds that would then be transferred to the corporation. They did. We started that way. We got a lot of money that came in fairly quickly that way. In a relatively short period of time, turned the whole thing over to the Lake Association.
Basically, the SLA is a private, not-for-profit organization whose sole intent has been to protect the water quality and also to help promote the protection of the water quality and also to promote sound environmental management of the watershed surrounding Skaneateles Lake. The city of Syracuse and some of the surrounding communities, probably approaching 250,000 people in central New York, get their drinking water from Skaneateles Lake. So it's a municipal water supply and it's unfiltered. It's sanitized with chlorine, but it doesn't need to be filtered prior to the chlorine administration.
The Watershed Protection Program is something that's required by New York State Department of Health. We've had watershed rules and regulations since the early 1900s. We also have a filtration avoidance that's mandated by the State Health Department. And that comes down to we don't filter our water. Skaneateles Lake is still of excellent water quality that we do not need to filter our water.
However, if you have a turbidity event in the lake occurring more than a certain number of times a year, and it shows up in the water supply, then they may force you to build a water treatment plant. And that's a bad thing because it's going to cost everybody a ton of money to get that done.
I believe it was the early 90s that was an estimate about $60 million. Today, the estimate would be probably well over double that.
There are three ways to take care of milfoil. One is to use chemicals. A second way is to pull them up by hand, just like you weed a garden where you go around to pick them up. And the third way is to mat the bottom, to smother them. But we couldn't use chemicals with a water supply for the city of Syracuse. So we had the other two options, and the one we could ramp up and get going quickest was the hand pulling. A critical thing that we did was to bring John Menepes into the project. And John designed a boat with a water pump on it and hoses that went down into the water and the divers would come down and they would actually pull the plant out of the bottom, and then they could stick it in that hose and that would suck it up into the boat. And then in the boat we had a bag that would would capture the milfoil as it came up out of the water. What we found was that the quality of the work varied quite a bit. If you didn't get down there and get the root ball, really get the roots and everything of the plant, it would regrow then the next year. And secondly, it was really labor intensive. So John started working on another way to do it, and that was to lay mats. And so he built up a whole bunch of these kinds of pieces of matting, and then we would take it to the site and lower it into the water, and the divers would roll it out like a carpet over the milfoil, and that would bury them, and they couldn't get light and couldn't survive, and they would die. It's just as if you took a piece of canvas and laid it on your lawn all summer. The grass would be dead underneath it. Same principle work there. Well, if it went unchecked, what would happen is that it would expand in the shallow water throughout the lake, wherever the habitat was appropriate. So I would anticipate that in almost all the bays and in the mouths of rivers or streams that come in, where they form a delta when that muddy water comes into the lake, would be filled with milfoil. And there is a carcinogenic compound that's formed as a result of putting chlorine into water that has a high organic content to it. That's the kind of threat that it would cause with the drinking water. Plus, it would add odors and tastes to the water too.
The nearshore area of this lake, which is about 35 to 36 miles in circumference, would be lined with thick mats of this milfoil weed. There'd be no swimming. Certainly would have impacted fishing, boating. It in fact would have affected property values, affecting local taxes, affecting the economic engine of this entire, not only Skaneateles, but central New York region. Going forward, probably clear, pure water is going to be our most important resource. I think, in this day and age of the changing climate and more aquatic and terrestrial invasive species moving into our environment, it's going to be even more difficult to maintain the water quality of any of our lakes, in particular Skaneateles Lake. And if we were to lose that filtration avoidance waiver, then that would change the whole game plan in terms of the advocacy and maintaining the watershed and maintaining the pristine nature of Skaneateles Lake.
He took the lead on the milfoil. And Bob has a good voice, and people listen to him when there's a problem. So I think he was key on getting the major players involved and everybody on board.
I think Bob was absolutely the most instrumental person. As the limnologist, as the lake expert, as the professor, and the ultimate catalyst, I think without Bob, we'd be really nowhere right now.